The grand showroom of Forrester Creations had never looked more radiant. Beneath vaulted ceilings lined with soft golden light, cascades of white orchids framed the runway that had, for decades, carried the dreams of designers and the ambitions of a dynasty. Tonight, however, the space had been transformed from a temple of couture into an altar of love. Crystal chandeliers shimmered like constellations suspended above a sea of elegant guests. The faint scent of gardenias drifted through the air, mingling with the quiet murmur of anticipation. At the end of the runway, where models once paused beneath the gaze of critics and cameras, an arch of ivory roses stood as witness to a different kind of unveiling. This was not a fashion debut. It was a wedding, and not just any wedding, but a union that promised renewal, redemption, and the fragile hope of happiness for Carter and Daphne. Carter stood tall beneath the arch, impeccably dressed yet visibly vulnerable in a way he had rarely allowed himself to be. For a man who had built his life on discipline, loyalty, and moral clarity, love had often been a battlefield he entered cautiously. Yet tonight there was no hesitation in his posture. His eyes were fixed entirely on Daphne as if the world beyond her had ceased to exist. She moved toward him in a gown that seemed spun from moonlight, every delicate thread catching the glow of the chandeliers. There was something ethereal about her, something almost too luminous to be real. In her expression shimmered a blend of anticipation and something more difficult to name. A flicker, perhaps, of tension she struggled to conceal. Around them stood the pillars of the Forrester family. Steffi watched with a poised smile that barely masked her relentless instinct to protect both her brand and those she considered family. Ridge observed with folded arms, his gaze analytical even in celebration, as though measuring the emotional fabric of the moment. Brooke stood beside him, radiant and reflective, believing in love even after witnessing its capacity to wound. And Eric, patriarch and visionary, regarded the scene with a quiet sentimentality, as though this union represented continuity in a world forever threatened by upheaval. When Carter began to speak, his voice carried across the showroom with calm sincerity. He spoke not only of love but of faith, the kind of faith that survives doubt and emerges stronger. He confessed that Daphne had reignited something within him he once feared extinguished. The courage to trust completely, to imagine a future defined not by caution but by devotion. His words were not extravagant, yet they were profound in their steadiness. He spoke of partnership, of shared battles and shared triumphs, of waking each morning with gratitude for the woman standing before him. His voice trembled only once, when he admitted that loving her had taught him vulnerability was not weakness but strength. Daphne listened as though absorbing every syllable into her skin. Yet behind her luminous composure, a shadow flickered. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her bouquet. A breath caught in her throat. There was love in her eyes. Yes, but also fear. The fear of someone standing at the edge of a precipice, aware that one wrong step could send everything crashing into ruin. For weeks she had convinced herself that the past could remain buried, that oceans and silence were sufficient to erase a mistake. She had believed that reinvention was possible, that distance could nullify obligation. Standing before Carter, she wanted nothing more than to believe her own narrative. The officiant invited Daphne to speak her vows. She opened her mouth, and for a moment, the words seemed to form naturally, shaped by longing and hope. She began to speak of destiny, of crossing continents and finding home in the least expected place. Her voice shimmered like glass under light. But just as she prepared to promise forever, a sudden commotion shattered the stillness. The grand doors of the showroom swung open with a force that echoed like thunder. Every head turned. A man stood silhouetted against the harsh white light of the hallway beyond. He was rugged, wind-worn, dressed not for celebration but for confrontation. There was salt in his hair and fire in his eyes. His presence felt less like an interruption and more like a reckoning. He walked forward with deliberate steps, ignoring the stunned gasps that rippled through the audience. Security hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene in a space meant for spectacle rather than scandal. Carter's expression hardened, protective instinct rising instantly. Daphne's face drained of color so swiftly it was as if someone had extinguished her from within. The man's voice cut through the room with unwavering conviction. He declared himself Daphne's husband. Not a former lover. Not a distant acquaintance. Her legal spouse. He spoke of a marriage solemnized overseas, documented, registered, binding. His words were not frantic accusations but calm assertions backed by certainty. The room seemed to tilt. Daphne's breath faltered. She stood frozen, eyes wide, guilt surfacing like a long-drowned truth forced to air. Carter looked at her, searching for denial, for outrage, for anything that would dismantle the claim. But what he found was silence. Steffi's composure shattered first. Fury flashed across her face, not merely as a friend but as a guardian of Forrester Creations. This was not only a personal betrayal unfolding. It was a public humiliation on the sacred stage of their brand. Ridge's jaw tightened, his protective anger palpable. Brooke's hand rose instinctively to her chest, as though bracing against the emotional tremor. Eric's eyes darkened with disappointment, not theatrical but profound. The man produced documents, official, stamped, undeniable. Marriage certificates bearing Daphne's signature. Photographs of a ceremony beneath foreign skies. Legal proof that transformed suspicion into fact. The evidence was methodical, irrefutable. Each page he revealed was another thread unraveling the illusion woven around this day. Carter felt something collapse within him. Not explosively but inwardly, like a structure imploding in silence. Betrayal is rarely loud at first, it is heavy. He searched Daphne's face one last time for explanation. For remorse. For truth. And he found all three colliding within her trembling gaze. The showroom descended into chaos. Whispers erupted into accusations. Phones emerged, recording what would inevitably become headlines. Forrester Creations, a house built on image and legacy, found itself at the epicenter of scandal. What was meant to symbolize romance now threatened reputational devastation. Steffi confronted Daphne with cutting indignation. Her anger rooted as much in business as in betrayal. Ridge demanded clarity, unwilling to tolerate deception beneath his roof. The unknown husband stood resolute, neither shouting nor retreating, simply asserting his rightful place in a narrative Daphne had attempted to rewrite without him. And Daphne, once radiant bride, stood encircled by consequence. Her silence no longer protected her. It condemned her. She had not told Carter because she feared losing him. She had not confronted her past because she hoped it would dissolve. But hope without courage had led her here. Carter stepped back, physically distancing himself as though proximity now burned. The love he had professed moments earlier lingered in the air like an echo mocking its own sincerity. He did not rage. He did not accuse. His devastation was quieter, more profound. The kind that fractures faith not only in another person but in one's own judgment. Outside, reporters began to gather, alerted by whispers spreading faster than containment. Within minutes, the scandal was no longer confined to a showroom. It was a storm engulfing the Forrester name. The episode closed not with resolution but with unbearable tension. Daphne faced two men bound to her by law and by love, each representing a different version of her identity. The husband from her past embodied unfinished obligation. Carter embodied the future she had dared to claim. Between them stretched the chasm of her own deception. Under the fading glow of chandeliers, surrounded by shattered expectation, Daphne understood that choice was no longer optional. She would have to decide. Not merely between two men, but between truth and self-preservation, between accountability and escape, and as the camera lingered on her conflicted face, the uncertainty of what she would choose became the most powerful cliffhanger of all. Morning light poured through the glass facade of Forrester Creations, turning the showroom floor into a river of pale gold. Bolts of silk shimmered like liquid treasure. Mannequins stood frozen in mid-pose as if listening, and assistants hurried between racks with the breathless urgency of a house forever balancing artistry and ambition. In the center of this orchestrated elegance stood Ivy, her posture triumphant, her smile edged with satisfaction sharp enough to cut. She did not raise her voice, yet the tone carried through the atelier with deliberate clarity. Dylan had left Los Angeles, she declared. The distraction, the complication, the nuisance who had lingered at the margins of their world was gone. The threat had evaporated. Order, Ivy insisted, had been restored. Her words were delivered not as gossip but as proclamation. In her mind, this was not cruelty, it was correction. Dylan's presence had unsettled alliances, stirred questions, and introduced an unpredictable current into a family that prided itself on legacy and control. Ivy had convinced herself that she was protecting something larger than pride. She was preserving hierarchy. In the ruthless ecosystem of high fashion, sentimentality was weakness. She believed she had done what was necessary to safeguard the Forrester name from scandal and dilution. Watching the subtle nods of agreement from a few sympathetic colleagues, she felt the intoxicating warmth of victory. The game had been played, and she had prevailed. Yet triumph, when built on incomplete knowledge, is fragile. Even as Ivy savored the illusion of finality, the city beyond the glass walls carried a different narrative. Across town at Il Giardino, beneath soft strings of lights that swayed gently in the coastal breeze, Dylan sat alone at a small wrought iron table. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation. The clink of glassware, the low murmur of late-morning patrons lingering over espresso. But around Dylan there was a stillness that felt carved from isolation. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, fingers wrapped loosely around a cup long gone cold. The confident spark she once carried seemed dimmed, replaced by introspection heavy enough to bend her posture. Dickie Sharp observed her from a distance before approaching. He had always possessed an instinct for wounded pride, for the subtle signals of someone standing at a crossroads between resignation and revelation. His face bore the gravity of a man carrying knowledge that could reorder lives. He did not rush. He crossed the patio slowly, each step deliberate, as though allowing the weight of what he carried to settle into the air before words disturbed it. In his hand was a sealed envelope, unassuming yet monumental. When he reached her table, Dylan looked up, surprise flickering across her features before recognition steadied her. There was no preamble, no attempt at light conversation. Dickie placed the envelope gently before her. The paper seemed ordinary, but the seriousness etched into his expression rendered it sacred and dangerous all at once. He told her quietly that inside were answers. Answers she had not even known to seek until doubt had begun to whisper through her nights. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The soft tear of paper sounded impossibly loud against the ambient noise of the restaurant. She unfolded the document slowly, eyes scanning the technical language, the numerical markers, the impersonal precision of science. At first there was confusion, a furrow between her brows as she deciphered the implications. Then the meaning crystallized and her breath faltered. Shock is not always explosive. Sometimes it arrives as a hollowing silence. Dylan's face drained of color. The cafe sounds blurred into distant echoes. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it might fracture her ribs. The DNA results were unequivocal. The genetic markers aligned beyond statistical doubt. The man whose name carried power across Los Angeles, the visionary, the patriarch, the symbol of couture excellence, was her biological father. Dickie spoke softly, confirming what the document declared. Eric Forrester, he said, was not merely a legend she had admired from afar. He was her blood. The secret had been buried decades ago, entangled in circumstances of youth, ambition, and choices made under pressure. It had remained concealed not out of malice, but out of fear of scandal, of destabilizing a carefully constructed empire, of reopening wounds best left sealed. But truth has a way of demanding emergence. It does not disappear, it waits. Dylan's mind reeled through memories now reframed by revelation. The inexplicable pull she had felt toward Forrester creations. The sense of belonging she could never rationalize. The instinctive understanding of fabric, of silhouette, of aesthetic intuition that seemed inherited rather than learned. What she had once dismissed as coincidence now felt like inheritance awakening. News in Los Angeles traveled with merciless speed. By the time Dylan left Il Giardino, the whisper had already begun its transformation into headline. An undisclosed Forrester heir, a daughter long lost, a bloodline expanded. Within hours, fashion blogs, industry insiders, and social circles buzzed with speculation. The Forrester dynasty, revered for its elegance and endurance, now faced a seismic shift in its narrative. Ivy learned of the revelation not through direct announcement, but through the abrupt hush that fell over a conversation when she entered a fitting room. Faces turned. Phones were subtly angled away. Curiosity replaced agreement in the air around her. When the confirmation reached her ears, that Dylan was Eric's daughter. The triumph she had basked in curdled into disbelief. She felt the ground tilt beneath the confidence she had so carefully staged. Anger surged first, sharp and immediate. How could fate conspire so cruelly? The woman she had dismissed as insignificant now stood elevated by bloodline. The hierarchy Ivy believed she had defended was being rewritten without her consent. Beneath the anger lurked something more fragile, fear. If Dylan possessed legitimate claim, then influence, authority, even creative power could shift. Ivy's position, once secure through proximity and loyalty, now felt threatened by genetics she could not compete with. Across town, Will and Electra absorbed the news with a mixture of astonishment and curiosity. The revelation did not immediately provoke hostility, rather, it stirred questions. A half-sister, a new branch of a family tree already dense with history. They wondered what kind of person Dylan truly was beyond headlines. Was she ambitious? Wounded? Loyal? Opportunistic? Blood created connection, but it did not guarantee alignment. At the center of the storm stood Eric Forrester himself. When the truth reached him, his first reaction was stunned silence. He had built an empire on vision and reinvention, yet he had not foreseen this reckoning. Memories long compartmentalized resurfaced with piercing clarity. A young woman he once loved in a season of vulnerability. A goodbye complicated by circumstance. A promise never revisited. He felt the collision of nostalgia and accountability. Regret, long dormant, unfurled like a forgotten sketch rediscovered in a drawer. Yet beneath the shock was something warmer. A yearning he had not realized he carried. The possibility of another child. Another legacy. Not of business but of blood. Stirred a paternal instinct both humbling and redemptive. Age had softened him. Where once he might have prioritized reputation, now he considered reconciliation. As cameras gathered outside Forrester Creations and reporters speculated on inheritance battles, Dylan found herself standing at the wrought iron gates of the Forrester estate. The mansion loomed beyond manicured hedges, its facade stately yet welcoming in the late afternoon light. She felt both dwarfed and summoned by its presence. Inside her, conflicting currents collided. Doubt whispered that she did not belong, that the world beyond the gates would scrutinize her motives and dissect her worth. Hope countered that belonging was not granted by permission but by truth. She was not arriving as an interloper seeking advantage. She was stepping forward as a daughter seeking acknowledgement. The weight of legacy pressed against her chest, but so did determination. She had spent years forging her identity without knowing its full origin. Now that origin demanded confrontation. She straightened her shoulders, the tremor in her hands subsiding into steadiness. Whatever awaited her, embrace or rejection, would at least be honest. Behind her, Los Angeles continued to churn with speculation. Ivy's fury simmered into strategy. Will and Elektra debated openness versus caution. Eric stood at a window within the estate, unaware that the very person redefining his future stood only yards away. Dylan drew a breath deep enough to steady the storm within her. She reached toward the gate, fingers brushing cool iron. In that suspended moment before action, she felt suspended between past and possibility. Then, with quiet resolve etched across her features, she prepared to step forward, into a family that was hers by blood, into a world that might resist her presence, and into a future no longer defined by exile but by truth. The episode closed on her silhouette framed against the estate's grandeur, her expression a fusion of vulnerability and courage. The question was no longer whether she belonged. It was whether the Forrester dynasty was ready to accept what it had unknowingly lost. And whether those who once dismissed her were prepared to face the reality that power sometimes arrives not through conquest, but through inheritance.